All right, so welcome back. Let's take a look at the next part of solving rational equations. This time we're going to have extraneous solutions when we solve it. So go in here, you can see our equation. And the first thing that we want to do is factor all of the denominators if possible. So here you got x minus 6 and x minus 2, nothing we can do there. But then we have this trinomial, which we can factor, and it factors to x minus 6 times x minus 2. So now what we need to do is find our least common denominator. Well, here you got x minus 6 times x minus 2. Here you already have an x minus 6. Here you already have an x minus 2. So this right here is going to be our least common denominator, which is x minus 6 times x minus 2. So now what we need to do is rewrite this equation using the least common denominator, making sure that we correct for our numerators. So let's go ahead and do that. So in order to make this into a fraction with the least common denominator, we have to multiply the top and the bottom by x minus 2. So I already have the 1 there. So I'm going to multiply that by x minus 2. And then in the bottom. So you can see that this is where we had to correct. And then in the second, I already have the x minus 2, so I have to multiply it by the x minus 6. I already have the x up top, so x minus 6. So I corrected with the x minus 6. And then the last is already has the least common denominator, so we don't have to correct for anything. All right. So now once we do that, once we have this written with our least common denominator, what we can do is go ahead and cross out the denominators, if you recall from the first part of the video. And we can take this, the numerator is going to be the equation that we're going to solve. So 1 times this is just going to give me x minus 2 plus, I'll multiply this out in a second, is equal to 4. So that is going to be the equation that we're going to solve. And we're going to go and do that now. So I'm going to do distributive property. And then I'm going to look to combine any like terms. So I have the x and the minus 6x here. Then I'm going to put the x squared in front. So I get x squared. That's going to give me minus 5x minus 2 is equal to 4. And then we're going to go ahead and move the 4 over. So that's going to give me x squared minus 5x minus 6 is equal to 0. So I set it equal to 0 because I could tell I was going to get trinomial. I'm going to want to factor this, solve by factoring. So when I take that, I'm going to bring that up over here. So I take this trinomial. And when I factor that, I get x minus 6 times x plus 1. And to solve by factoring, just set each factor equal to 0. So x minus 6 equals 0. And then solve it. So we get x equals 6. And x equals negative 1. So now here, what we need to do is we need to check each one of these solutions to make sure they're true. If not, then one of them would be an extraneous solution. So there's a couple ways you can do this. A, you could graph this right here. So you could graph the left side separately, then graph the right side, graph them on the same coordinate plane, and wherever they intersect would be a solution. Or you could take each one of these separately and plug them in and make sure the left side is equal to the right side. Now, if you do that by plugging in, you can see if I take the 6 right here, and if I start plugging this in, what's going to happen in the denominator? I'm going to get 6 minus 6, which is equal to 0, which means that I would be dividing by 0, which we can't have. So I already know that this cannot be the solution. It's an extraneous solution. And if you plug in negative 1, you will see that it is true. Or if you graph, like I said, you will see that it intersects at negative 1. So negative 1 is the solution. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. You can see we got numbers 2 and 3 up here. So looking at number 2, there's nothing that we can factor in a denominator, so we're just going to identify the least common denominator, which here is just going to be x minus 3. So what we're going to do is write this now with our least common denominator, correcting for our numerators. So in the first fraction, we just need to multiply by x minus 3, and x minus 3 here. So just correcting for that. And then everything else we can just write because it already has the least common denominator. So now once we do that, we can get rid of our denominators and just use the numerators here as the equation that we're going to solve. So that's going to give me x times x minus 3 plus 6 is equal to 2x. And I'm just going to go ahead and solve that. So distributive property, x squared minus 3x plus 6 is equal to 2x. Now I'm going to move this over to here because I already see the trinomial. So subtract that. And that's going to be x squared minus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0. So now I'm going to go ahead and factor this and solve by factoring. So when I factor it, I get x minus 2 times x minus 3 is equal to 0. And of course, when I set these equal to 0 and solve them, here I get x equals 2. And then here I get x is equal to 3. So remember, we need to take these, plug them in, and check. If I look at the 3 right away, if I plug that in here, I can see I'm going to get 3 minus 3, which is 0. So I can't have that. That's not going to be true. If I were to plug in the 2, if I plug it into the left side and then plug into the right side, I'll see that the left side equals the right side. Or if I graph this side and graph this side on the same coordinate plane, you will see that they intersect at 2. So 2 is the solution. Looking at number 3 here, I'm going to have to factor whatever denominators I can. So here I could take out 5, leaves me with x plus 1. And then here, this is going to be x plus 2 times x plus 1. So now my least common denominator, I have x plus 2 and x plus 1 here. I have an x plus 2, I have an x plus 1, but I also have a 5. So my least common denominator is going to be 5 times x plus 2 times x plus 1. So now I need to correct for all of the numerators. So in the first one, I already have the x, and I have a 5 and x plus 1 in the bottom, so I'm missing the x plus 2. So rewrite that. So here I had to multiply top and bottom by x plus 2. And then here, I already have a 1, and I have the x plus 2 in the bottom, so I'm missing the 5 and the x plus 1. So I had to multiply by 5 and x plus 1, 5 and x plus 1. And then here, I'm only missing the 5. So 1 is already in the top times 5. And rewrite this. So all I had to do was correct with the 5. So now we can go ahead and get rid of our denominator and use the numerators as the equation. So that's going to be x times x plus 2 is equal to 1 times 5 is 5. So let's do that right there. Plus, and then 1 times 5, of course, is 5. So now I'm going to do distributive property both here. So I get x squared plus 2x is equal to 5x plus 5. And then, of course, I got the plus 5 again right here. Like terms. So 5x plus 10. And I'm going to go ahead and just move these over. So that gives me x squared minus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. And then I'm going to go ahead and factor. So I get x plus 2 times x minus 5 is equal to 0. And of course, we want to solve by factoring. So set those equal to 0. So I get x plus 2 is equal to 0. X minus 5 is equal to 0. And when I solve those, I get x equals -2 here, and x equals 5 here. So then if I look to check those and plug them in, I can see right away if I plug in the -2 here, that's going to give me a 0 in the denominator, which we can't have. So that's no good. And if I were to plug the 5 in, of course, the left side would equal the right side. If I were to graph the left side and then to graph the right side in the same coordinate plane, you would see they intersect at x equals 5. So 5 is the solution for that. All right, so let's take a look at number 4. All right, so looking at number 4, you can see that there's nothing that we can do to factor in a denominator, so we just have to identify or find our least common denominator. So our least common denominator for this one, here we have an x, here we know there's a 1, and then we got a 4x, so our least common denominator is going to be 4x. So then what we need to do is go ahead and correct for our numerators. So here I already have the x plus 1, and I need to multiply by the 4 because that's what I'm missing in the bottom. So I'm going to do that, top and bottom. And then the 1, I'm missing everything, so it's going to be 4x over 4x, the least common denominator. And then for here, I already have the least common denominator, so I don't need to correct for anything here. So once we have our equation written with the least common denominator, we can go ahead and get rid of those denominators and use the numerators as our equation. So this is going to be 4 times x plus 1 is equal to 4x minus, now be careful because you're subtracting this whole thing, so we're going to have to distribute that minus sign. A lot of students make that mistake, they forget when they're subtracting this, you're going to have to distribute the minus sign. So now when I distribute the 4 here, I get 4x plus 4 is equal to 4x, now minus x squared, plus 3x, and then plus 4. So I have like terms on this side. So I have 4x plus 4 is equal to negative x squared plus 7x plus 4. So now here, I can move these two over here because I only have to move those two terms, and I would get my trinomial, but you would have a leading coefficient that's negative, which is fine because then I can just divide both sides by -1 to make it positive, because you don't want to factor with the leading coefficient being negative. Or I could just move all three of these to this side here, which would make my x squared term positive. So it's totally up to you what you want to do. So I'll just go ahead and move all 3 of these over to this side. So I'm going to add x squared, subtract 7x, and subtract 4. And when I do that, it's going to give me x squared minus 3x is equal to 0. Now some students get confused by this because it's not a trinomial. So they're like, well, what am I going to do from here? I don't know how to actually solve this. Well, you can factor it. We can definitely solve this by factoring. It has a common factor of x. So if I take out an x, that leaves me with x minus 3 is equal to 0. That is factored. So now what I can do is go ahead and set those factors equal to 0, including the x, because even though it's a common factor, it's a variable, so you have to set it equal to 0 itself. So x is equal to 0, then x minus 3 is equal to 0. And of course, when I solve this, I get x is equal to 3. So I have x equals 0, and I have x equals 3. So now we need to plug them back in to check. Well, if I take the x equals 0 and plug it back in, well, automatically when I put that in for x, I get 0 in the denominator, which we know we can't have. So that's not going to work. And again, if you take the 3 and you plug it into this whole thing, you will see that the left side is equal to the right side. Or if you graph this side and then graph this side, you will see that they intersect at x equals 3, which is the solution for number 4. All right, well, hopefully that these problems will help you solve the rational equations with extraneous solutions. No, part 1, we didn't have any extraneous solutions, and we saved that for part 2. And next time, we'll see you with the next topic. Take care.